All right, we're going to be continuing on in our sermon series. We're talking about sovereignty and the relationship between God and politics. Let me recap where we've been. So our goal in this sermon series is not to give us every answer to every political question. Our goal is to get us to a God-centric perspective on the topic of politics. How do we have a theological perspective that then influences our political perspective? And so the first week we talked about God's sovereign reign over the whole universe. And then last week we talked about 5 principles of political engagement. What are ways we need to frame our thinking to be biblical when we engage politically? Today what I want to do is I want to take us to a text in the scripture so we can see these principles lived out. And we're going to see what we talked about last week applied in scripture and also draw some more truth out for ourselves. So if you got a Bible or you've got a Bible app, we're going to be in the book of Daniel, starting in Daniel chapter 1. We do have free Bibles available there on the seats, the light blue Bibles. We also have a slew of study Bibles available at the Resource Center for more than half off. So if you're interested in a study Bible, this is the place to get it because they're very inexpensive. But Daniel chapter 1 is where we're going to be today. I'm going to read through the first 6 verses. And then we'll continue on, and we're going to kind of jump around a couple places in the text today. But let me start in Daniel chapter 1, and we read this. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter into the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So let me summarize what we've read so far. Let me give you a little peek behind the curtain real quick. If you're not sure how to pronounce an Old Testament name, say it confidently and nobody knows. That's the trick. Just if you say it with oomph, they're like, I guess that's it, right? But here's what happened. You have a foreign ruler in Babylon comes to the nation of Israel, comes to Jerusalem, and besieges it. He takes over the city. And then he says, I want you to find young men, capable men. He says no physical defect, they're handsome, they have aptitude, so good-looking and smart young men. Take them and train them up in the ways of Babylon. And after a little while, we're going to put these men into positions of leadership. And so those men who are selected, some of them we see here, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And as we continue on to verse 8, it says, But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission to not defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. So the question we should ask is, why would Daniel do this? Again, you have a king from a foreign nation comes in, besieges Jerusalem, takes some of these young men out to train them up in this new culture. They're going to feed them well. They're going to take care of them. Daniel says, just give us vegetables and water. We don't want anything from the king's table. So when you dig into it, some people they said initially when they looked at this, well, maybe it's because the Jews had specific dietary laws and this food would be considered unclean. The problem with that is that they seem to be drinking the wine and engaging in other activities that would be considered unclean as well. So that's probably not what it is. Another idea that's put forward is that for health reasons, you may have heard of the Daniel diet. There's nothing in the scripture that would tell us that they're doing this for health reasons. Nothing in the text says that. Another one would be some people say, well, maybe it's because this food was sacrificed to idols, and so spiritually that's unclean, so they shouldn't partake of this food. Again, they're partaking of other things that could have been sacrificed to idols, so that's probably not it. So if you dig into the scholarship, most scholars say that the reason why Daniel and his friends chose to do this was because they wanted to keep themselves from being tempted into getting too deep into the Babylonian culture. They were drawing a line that they basically said, while it would be okay for us to eat this food, if we do, will it start us on a trajectory that will guide us away from the ways of Yahweh, the one true God, and lead us into other things. You see, they realized that while the food itself may not be dangerous, there are implications connected to the food. And it makes sense, right? If you're sitting at the king's table, you're eating the king's food, you're probably going to get other benefits from that. You're going to rub shoulders with other people in power and authority. I wrote down here that they would engage in other things and they would be tempted with earthly pleasures, food, housing, social advantages, women, the list goes on. And so Daniel and his friends drew a line and they said, we don't want to set ourselves up for falling into temptation, so let's draw the line here and not way out there. The question they asked is, how far can we stay away from the edge of the cliff? Not how close can we get and still not fall off. And so they drew a line and they said, we don't want to get sucked into this. And last weekend, if you remember, we talked about the danger of power in politics. So they were kind of giving us the application point here in that they realized that if they got drawn in, they could start taking advantage of all these different things and start wandering away from the ways of God. Like I literally wrote here in the notes, if you're captured by a foreign nation, they're not overly concerned with you. In this time, life was very much considered expendable. So they weren't, because of their status, they weren't sleeping on inflatable mattresses, if you get what I'm saying, right? They were in great accommodations, being taken care of really well, and they knew that they could get drawn in deeper and deeper and deeper, and so they said, no, we're not going to engage in that. We're going to stay away from that so that we don't start running down that line. Now let's take it from Daniel, who is clearly being set up for political authority to be a leader, and let's take it to our day and age. Here's a direct application point. Let us be cautious to give power to those who have strong earthly appetites. Let's be cautious when we give power to those who have strong earthly appetites. It is the state of humanity, who we are as human beings, that when we are given access to things that we enjoy, we go deeper in and deeper in and deeper in. And so when you and I give political authority to somebody who is already inclined that way, there's great danger. Here's how I wrote it. I wrote it this way. When we see political candidates who seem to have unbridled lust, and here's the possible lists: sexual lust, lust for power, lust for control, lust for compliance, lust for keeping their family in power, lust for being liked and praised. Let us be cautious with empowering that type of political authority. Because Daniel knows, even though he has the best intentions, he can get drawn in. And if somebody's already running down that road, we need to be careful if we give them too much authority. So there's a political application. Now let's make it more personal for you and me. Where do you and I need to say no to something in life? Because it can lead us down a road that can be dangerous in the future. Are there things right now that may be quote unquote neutral, but they're setting you on a path that if you continue down that path, it could be really dangerous 6 months or a year from now? Are we aware of those things that we can get drawn in? And here's the deal. The danger of us as human beings is that we always think we are really, really, really special. But here's the tension. We are. Every single being made in the image of God as an individual. We individually have a relationship with God. And yet there is the human state where we look at somebody else's failures and we go, that could never happen to me. So let's not look at this and go like, well, that wouldn't happen to me. It could happen to any one of us. So let's be cautious. I'll give you a really practical example for me. By the nature of my vocation, my job, I'm engaged with and kind of maybe exposed to some deeper spiritual things, including the demonic, things with the occult, things with Satanism. And I can just tell you, like unabashedly, when those types of things come up, I take 3 big steps back. Because I just know how my mind works, how my soul works. Those things feel very heavy to me. And so I try not to expose myself to anything like broadly in the culture, or if I get into a situation that I really feel like I need to lean into, you better believe there's 2 or 3 of us. I don't go in and say, well, I'm a pastor. Jesus said to Peter, Peter, Satan wants you and he will sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. This is one who walked with Jesus. And so because of that awareness, I say when that path comes before me, I take a couple steps back and say, okay, if I'm going to walk this path at all, let me do it with some other people. Now, where, not just in your work, but where in your life do you need to be more aware of the potential danger down the road and make a decision now to not walk toward the cliff, but to stay away from the cliff? In Daniel's circumstance, he knew as he gained more power and political influence, it could lead him astray, and so he drew a line early on. So let's continue on going into chapter 2. Okay, so Daniel, actually, he doesn't eat the food of the king's table. He does really well, and he's started to get promoted in these roles of authority and influence. Daniel chapter 2 says this, "In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Then the astrologers answered the king, May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. The king replied to the astrologers, This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble." That's a day when you don't want to be a magician. I want to just as a side note here point out that there are certainly things day by day and year by year that we should be concerned about in our culture and in our political system. But let's remember, it's not like this. This was standard practice back then. It was I'm the king. I don't like this person. Kill him. And they weren't well, we got to have the appeals first. And that didn't happen. It was you're dead. If you know the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah hears that the walls around the sacred city of Jerusalem have been torn down. And so he goes to the king, who's a foreign king, to ask for resources. And it says Nehemiah came forward and he was sad. And the king says, Your face is downcast, Nehemiah. This can only be sadness of heart. What's happening? And Nehemiah says, I was terribly afraid. Why? Because you don't walk into the presence of the king in a bad mood. Right? They could have been what's your deal? You're the cupbearer. You're done. Get somebody else in. Kill him. That simple. So this response of the king, we might hear this and go this is crazy. Standard practice back in the day. If you're the king, you make the call. And so he basically says, I've had a dream. It's really troubling me. And the magicians are tell us what it is and we'll interpret it for you. He says, you tell me what it is or everybody's going to die. So strong response. Then if you'll jump down to verse 16, we hear that Daniel went to the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They urged him to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery so that he and his friends may not be executed with the rest of the wise men in Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises others up. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness. The light dwells in him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. So the king says, I'm going to kill everybody if you don't tell me what my dream is. Daniel says basically, just give us a little bit. We're going to go pray about it, and we're going to tell you what the dream is. So they go and they pray, and God reveals what the dream is. Now, we can't go into the whole book of Daniel, but there's a great little section there where he shows up, and Daniel tells him what the dream is, and then Daniel goes, just so you know, I don't know what the dream is. And the king's like, what? And he says, but I know a God who knows the dream. And here's what that God told me. And so note a couple things here. That first, Daniel, who is in a place of influence, goes to prayer. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how to interpret this dream, but God does. So he goes to prayer. And remember, this is Daniel who was handpicked as somebody pleasing to the eye, of great intelligence, and yet he's like, despite all my natural abilities, I need God to show up. He knows his source of strength, so he goes to prayer. Now, you and I probably can't know all the ins and outs of political players today. But when I hear somebody mention that they are prayerful about something, my ears perk up to go, there seems to be a sense of humility in that politician that maybe they don't know everything. So Daniel goes to prayer. Another thing we note is that when he sees what the dream is, when he gets the interpretation, look, he gives credit to God. He doesn't say, I'm really a big deal. I figured this out. He describes God as sovereign. I think it's in verse 21 where he says, he changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises others up. I mean, think about that. There's a king who's going to kill you if you don't bring the interpretation. And Daniel's like, yeah, but the God I know cannot only give the interpretation, he can take this king out in a moment. One out, one in. Just like that king could put you to death, this God can take you out and bring another in. Daniel prays, and then he acknowledges God's power and authority. Here's the third thing. I think this is really important for us, maybe politically, but maybe even more so personally. Daniel interprets the dream. His friends are raised up into leadership. And you think, okay, the king gets it. Like Daniel and his friends are connected to the God of the universe. Something's going to change here. And then read chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, I'll just tell you, when I read Daniel, when I get to the end of chapter 2, I'm like, the king's going to turn over a new leaf. And he's going to be like, you're connected to this God. I'm going to follow your God. That's great. The beginning of the next chapter, he's like, let's make an idol. It can be easy for us to read this and to miss out on the fact that Daniel did the right thing in the moment, but realize that that doesn't mean everything in the future is going to change. And I think sometimes for us, when we engage politically, we can make a right choice, or we can see a politician who makes a right choice, and then we can go, it's all moving in the right direction. And then the next day, that same politician makes a terrible choice, and we're like, I thought things were different. But Jesus talks about this in the New Testament when he says, sufficient is each day with its own trouble. Because I can't solve all the problems doesn't mean I can't solve the problem that's right here in front of me. So let us remember when we make decisions, whether it's for our own lives or in a political sphere, that make the right decision now and then make the right decision the next moment and the next moment. But it doesn't mean that every politician who makes a good choice is going to make the next good choice. That sometimes is where we throw up our hands. We're like, it's all corrupt. Well, the world's a broken place, and you and I are part of that brokenness too. But Daniel made the right choice in that moment, and there was a positive response. It was ultimately in that moment, the right thing came out of it. Now, when you jump into chapter 3, things start to turn a little bit here. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he makes this image of gold. And if you jump down to verse 4, it says, this herald loudly proclaims, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, can we get a zither next week? Thank you. Lyre, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. Told you, like he can do whatever he wants to do. Right? He's like, tell me my dream or you're dead. Worship this thing or I'm going to throw you into a furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the pipe, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. And whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into the blazing furnace. And guess what? Daniel and his friends are not bowing down. Okay, so we have Daniel who politically is playing ball at the beginning. He's like, okay, I'll tell you the interpretation of your dream. And then he's told to bow down, and he says, not doing it. The text says that the king goes, no big deal, I really like these guys. That's not what it says. It says the king is enraged. And he says, Get those guys. I want to talk to them. And so he's like, is this true? That this decree I gave to you, you're ignoring? And they're like, yeah. And the king is like off his rocker at that point. The end goal of what he does is it says he heats the fire in the furnace 7 times hotter, such that some of the men who serve under the king who are worshiping or serving at the furnace are consumed by the fire. And the king's like, you're going to defy me? Watch what happens. So Daniel has gone from like in favor with his friends to not so great with the king. Verse 16 says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him. Now these are the 3 friends of Daniel. They say, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Now, if you know the story, the miracle here is that they're thrown into the fire. And it says that the king looks into the fire and says, I thought we threw in 3 people, but I see 4. It's supposed to be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says, but I see a 4th in there, and he looks like a son of God. And you're like, aha. So this, most scholars say it could be an angel, but even more so, it's likely a pre-incarnate Christ present with these 3 men in the furnace. Now, we could read that and therefore conclude, okay, here's what's described, so here's what's prescribed. As long as you do the right thing, God will always deliver. But we know that isn't the case, right? Jesus lived a perfect life, and yet he was crucified. So there's a great example of doing the right thing and getting not so great results in an earthly sense. What I want you to see here is not the results, but the approach of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here's what they say. We don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. They're implying we're not going to bow down to this false idol. We will not do something that's in defiance of the law that we know as followers of Yahweh. God says, don't bow down before idols. We're not doing it. And then they continue on. They say, you throw us into this furnace, God can rescue us. But it doesn't end there. They say, and even if he doesn't, we're still not bowing down. I think that's the most important part of this text right here. Because if every time we stand for God, God delivers us, and there's like this great story, it actually makes it pretty easy. Because you're like, well, God's on my side. He's always going to deliver, so I'm always on the winning team. I'll do that. But that's not what happens all the time. And they know that, and so they say, even if God doesn't deliver us, we're still going to do the right thing. Here's the principle for you and me, and this is directly applicable to how we engage in politics. If a law of our government calls us to immoral actions, we reject it, we stand on the truth of God, and we leave the results, good or bad, in God's hands. Let me say it again. If a law of our government calls us to immoral actions, we reject it, stand up for the truth of God, and we leave the results, good or bad, in God's hands. That is different than saying, God, I'll follow you, and I'll stand for you, and you'll always deliver me. Because these guys could have been killed. And there are plenty of examples in the Old and in the New Testament of people saying, this is what the culture says to do, but I'm going to stand for righteousness. And the culture at large doesn't go, that's really brave of you. We support your decision. More times than not, they're like, kill them. Again, we're in a culture where, thanks be to God, that is not the first reaction of most people in our country. There might be hatred, there might be vitriol, you might even get arrested, but back in the day, it was like stone them to death, stone her to death. But the call here that we see is to say, we have to stand up for what's right and then entrust the results to God. That takes courage and that takes faith. Last week we talked about righteousness over pragmatism. Here's an example. They chose the right thing, not the easy thing. The easy thing would be like, here's what they would do. Guys, get together. We know we don't really worship this thing. In our heart of hearts, that's not what we're doing, but we're just going to bow down. Pretend we'll wink at each other, and then we'll stand up, and then we're alive. And we can do more good in the system, and so that's why we're doing it. But they knew that there was a command that said, do not do this. And so they said, we're going to choose the hard thing, even if it's going to cost us our lives. My question for us is, are we willing to be those types of people who will stand for righteousness? Listen to my words now. In defiant love. Not just defiance, but in defiant love. The love of these men for God and for the truth of God is what drove them. They weren't standing up to make a cultural crusade. They were already in Babylon. They weren't going to win the cultural battle right there. They weren't like, this is a war and we're going to take our country back. It wasn't their country. And so they were like, we're just going to do the right thing. And we're driven by our love for God and our love for the law, and we're going to let the chips fall where they may. That's a heart test for us. When we feel the need to stand in defiance of something legally or within the culture, is our motivating factor, back to what we started with last week, is it love or is it I'm going to stick it to the man? Those are two very different motivations. One is driven at the source by the gospel and the goodness of Jesus. The other one is driven by my flesh saying, I'm better than that person. I'm smarter than that person. I'm going to show them. These guys are like, we're just going to let the chips fall where they may. I want to also note here that this isn't a call for us to stand in defiance of something we don't like. It's to stand in defiance of something that's immoral. Right? So some law gets passed, you're like, I really don't like that law. I'm going to take a stand. You can take a stand within our political system by calling your representative or starting a petition, but we aren't given the right to just say, because I don't like it, I'm going to reject it, and now I'm going to be defiant against the government. What we take a stand against is when something is clearly unrighteous. Then we say, okay, I'm going to stand for righteousness and let the chips fall where they may. This is not the opportunity for us just to go, it makes me a little bit annoyed. I'm a Christian, I can do whatever I want. Like, that's not the heart of Jesus. Let us remember that the directives are from God, and if we're called to break one of his directives, then we stand in defiance and trust the rest to him. And let us remember that Jesus is the perfect example of this. Though the situation was unrighteous on an earthly level, Jesus' words to the Father is, I commit my spirit into your hands, not into the hands of the government. This is Jesus. This is Jesus who during his trial says, don't you understand? I could call down legions of angels to win this battle, but instead I submit because there's something greater that's going on here. The book of Daniel is a great glimpse into what it looks like to engage in the political context, but also to know that my kingdom that I live for and I live in is not of this earth. It's for the eternal kingdom of God. And he has put me here to engage in this time and this place, but my true home is with the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's Christ. Here's what I wrote in conclusion. The goodness of God comes to us in many forms. One of them in that he shows us through the life of Daniel and his friends that we can apply God's truth to whatever vocation we find ourselves, whatever political circumstance we're in. His word is applicable. His word gives us strength and courage. And my prayer for us is that we would live like Daniel and his friends and have the courage, driven by defiant love where necessary, to be a witness for the one true God. May he strengthen us to that end.